Hi, I'm Priscilla Murolo. I teach history at Sarah Lawrence College. I'm a labor historian, and I also direct the graduate program in women's history. Oh gosh, that is hard to say. I think that what makes me proudest are the times when alums of the program come back and they talk about their work. So, for example, this summer, a woman named Jessie Ramey came and spoke about some of her work as an organizer in the schools in Pittsburgh. And Jessie is now she runs a center for the study of women at Chatham University in Pittsburgh. But she came to speak about her activism. This week, another Jessie Wilkerson, who is now a professor at the University of Mississippi, came to speak about her work as a historian of women's activism in Appalachia. And that was a wonderful moment. LaShonda Barnett came last year to speak about her work as a writer. And those are my proudest moments. When I see people come back, and I knew them as students, and I saw their struggles as students and their accomplishments as students. And then there it is, 5 years later, 10 years later, 15 years later, and they have really embarked on these wonderful endeavors. I'm really proud of them.
How did you collect? Do you just collect these over the years?
Yeah, sometimes these are two old students standing in front of the monument to the Haymarket Martyrs. Lucy Parsons' husband and 4 others were hanged, and they were leaders of the labor movement in Chicago. This is the hair of a woman named Meredith Helton, the late Meredith Helton. She was a labor organizer who had been my student, and she was there looking at a marker to memorialize workers killed in a little town in South Carolina during the textile strike of 1934. How exhausting it is. It's really tiring. Well, actually, I think that the biggest thing I learned from teaching is that I'm less important than I thought I was at first. When I was a young teacher, I really believed that I was actually teaching people. But now I believe that what I'm doing is creating an environment in which students can learn. And that's very different. Now, I have information to share because I'm older, I've lived longer, I've read more books, and I do have information to share. But I think of my job as a professor as creating an environment in which the books and articles I ask people to read and the questions I pose about them can lead those students to deeper understandings of their world, of the past, and deeper thought about the future. So I guess I'm not really sure if that's what most people think of as teaching at all. I would think of myself as kind of a learning facilitator. Washington cross-dressing the Delaware is someone gave me, and I just love it. I think it's so cool. This is a real poster. This was a poster that originally appeared in a business magazine right after World War I, and it suggests that if you buy Scott tissue towels for your workers to have in their bathrooms, they will be less angry and less radical. Well, the women's history program is, in my opinion, much more vital than it was when it was in its infancy. Now, I happened to work at Sarah Lawrence in the 1970s as an administrative assistant and as a lower level administrator. This was before I was finishing my bachelor's degree here, and I worked full-time at the college. And so I knew the women's history program then, and then I was away and came back and here as a faculty member 8 years later. The program was much less diverse in its student body then, much less diverse in the range of interests that people brought to the program. If you look at the MA theses people produced in the first 5 or 6 years, an probably half of them were about the suffrage movement. And there's nothing wrong with writing about the suffrage movement, but they were, this was the US suffrage movement, and the US suffrage movement in the early 20th century. So now people do all kinds of thesis work. Over the past few years, for example, we've had a thesis on women higglers, that is, women street vendors in Jamaica. We had a thesis on Manuela Sáenz, who is a nationalist revolutionary in Andean Latin America. She was Simón Bolívar's partner in the Andean revolutions. We've had theses on really all manner of things. We had a thesis on gender's meaning in the Young Lords Party and how the Young Lords Party, this Puerto Rican revolutionary group in New York City, had made common cause with the Gay and Lesbian Liberation Front. It's just a much wider range of students, and it's a much wider range of interests they bring to the program, and then it produces a much wider range of scholarship. I would say that over the past 10 years or more, there's been a steadily growing influence on practical applications of the kind of knowledge that people have here. And it was really in recognition of that we inaugurated last year this program that's an accelerated program in which people, in place of the traditional thesis, do some kind of research-based work that leads to a practical application of historical knowledge of women and gender. So I'm expecting wonderful things about that. I'm not sure what everyone's going to do for their capstone work, but I know that one of them is likely to be on the practical services for sex workers. Another is likely to be on rape prevention programs at colleges and universities, assessing these prevention programs that are now mandated by the federal government, and figuring out which ones work best. And I think one is likely to be on some kind of digital archive. In other words, what are the possibilities for starting museums online? And another, I know, is going to be about women tattoo artists. And I think that that's a really wonderful range of topics. So I'm really impressed by what young feminists have brought to the program. And we've had male students too. We graduated the first man in 2003, and since then we've probably had half a dozen. And they have, I would say that the men have come into it in a way that they were attracted especially by gender studies. It was a man, DeWes Casey, who wrote the thesis on the Gay Liberation Front and the Young Lords Party. Joshua Regal, who was here last year to speak. He went on to law school at New York University, where he was a Ruth Tilden scholar. He wrote a thesis on the meanings of gender in the book Black Power, written by Kwame Ture, then Stokely Carmichael, and Charles Hamilton. So the men tend to come with an interest especially in gender analysis, the meanings of gender. And the cross-fertilization that has resulted, and it's really just adding to the diversity of the student body, it adds to the richness of the intellectual life. First men who came were gay men. And they came into the program. Now, that's not true of all the men who've come to the program, but they came into the program with a lot of interest in the history of gender and the meanings of gender. Those were the questions that they brought. Sometimes a student comes into the program with kind of unformulated interests. He or she might say to me, well, I'm just really interested in women, and I love women, and I want to study women. And then we try to move that student toward an analysis. What exactly do you mean by women? Who defines what a woman is? And to move them toward a study of gender. And I think that the men, maybe because they had been, the first ones had been Sarah Lawrence undergraduates first, and they were gay men who had studied gender at Sarah Lawrence, and they came into the program with very well-developed interests in the history of gender. They didn't believe that gender was something ordained by nature or God. They believed that it was something constructed by human beings, and societies. And I don't think that's peculiar to the men by any means. I just think that these particular men brought that kind of cross-fertilization. It may have made it less of a sorority, I think that in the first years of the program, almost all the students were white women. Right? And they may have felt more of a sisterhood with each other because they're so much alike, right? They weren't all cookie cutters, but they were so much more alike. But the students are pretty diverse now, and they come with a lot of different questions. And sometimes they come because they are interested in history, and the interest in women's studies is secondary to the interest in history. And that's true probably of more of the women than of the men. The men tend to come, they're very interested in gender. The women sometimes come because they just want a really good master's program in history, where they will be respected, right? And the kinds of research that they're drawn to will be respected, which is not always easy to find when you're in a history program that is gendered male. Mm-hmm. And this is one of my favorite things. It always takes a while for people to figure out what it is, right? It's a chessboard, and it's called People's Chess. And I'll read see the pawns?
The pawns
are
the back.
And what it says is, People's Chess, or how the pawns of each nation sacrificed their entire ruling classes and lived happily ever after. There are two questions there, really, that I hear. One is a question about what is the value of a master's degree in history, period. And my best response to that is to point to our alums, some of whom write for a living, some of whom teach for a living, some of them are professors, some of them work for non-governmental organizations, some of them are fundraisers. They do a range of things, and they are very successful women and men. I think that that's the best answer to that question. Regarding women's history in particular, that kind of question is usually asked by someone who doesn't understand women's history very well and imagines that what women's history must be is that women get together and say, boy, were we screwed over by history. And we're angry about it. We're really going to change this. We're going to get together and we're going to change this. And that's not what women's history is about. What women's history does is it shines a light on history generally. For example, consider the Roosevelt administration during the 1930s, the administration of Franklin D. Roosevelt. If you do not understand that Mrs. Roosevelt, Eleanor Roosevelt, was a trade unionist, she was a union member. She belonged to the newspaper guild because she wrote a daily column. She was a progressive. She was an activist. If you don't understand that, you would never really comprehend how the Roosevelt administration could build an alliance with the American labor movement. You couldn't get it. You just wondered, how could that have happened? If you don't understand issues of gender, there's a lot of history, the rest of history, that you can't understand. What I ask people often is, what does this show us about the big picture that we wouldn't otherwise see? What is it that the study of women, or the use of gender as an analytic category, can reveal about history that we would not otherwise understand? And that's what we talk about in women's history. It's not the wrongs that men have done to women. We don't really need to educate ourselves to that. You can just read the newspaper and see that. You just live and experience that. So women's history is really not the catalog of wrongs. And in fact, far from it. I would say that for the past 30 years, women's history has been mostly about the agency of women, women as agents of their own destiny. And more, it's been about gender as an analytic category, the way that society divides people, categorizes people, and not just into male or female, but sometimes gay or straight, or cisgender or transgender. That these categories themselves have histories that we try to figure out by using gender as an analytic category. There's Mother Jones, and there's Harriet Tubman, and there are various. This, because I'm a mother, I appreciate it. Someone gave this to me. It's a woman with 2 little children saying, "Who are these children and why are they calling me mommy?" I just love this. There's a sheep standing up in a whole group of sheep, and he says, wait, listen to me. We don't have to be just sheep. Well, I think that people who want to see a better world, whatever their field happens to be, have an obligation to do something. And history is not made around a seminar table. Sometimes when you're in school for a long time, you can get the mistaken impression that what one says at the seminar table and writes in a paper will actually change the world. Unlikely. Yes, I do think that people, that historians who are committed to a better world have the obligation to do something about that. But then the doing is not just going down to Zuccotti Park to stay, though that's a perfectly valid thing to do. I went down there a few times myself, so I've got no quarrel with going down to Zuccotti Park. But I think it's also important to recognize that there are many things one can do as a radical intellectual that are important. The world is in need of understanding of the lives of ordinary people, for example. I'm a labor historian, and I can tell you that some of the most satisfying work that I have done, that I viewed as political work, is in labor education. So taking labor history to working people, I think, is an important thing to do. And so I do that as a historian, and I think of that as work. That's part of my historical work, but that's political work as well. But there are many ways that historians can be useful to movements. Teaching people history is one way. Writing history for the everyday reader is a very important way to engage in political work that builds movements. And I think that our graduates and our students who get involved in that find that it's also very satisfying. There's nothing more satisfying than seeing that you have done some kind of intellectual work as a historian that actually matters to advancing a good cause. Here I am at Zuccotti Park. So this is with a student who was one of my students in the Southwest class, and I ran into her at Zuccotti Park. My husband took this picture. This is a picture of Ella Baker. This is the gravesite of Claudia Jones, who was deported from the United States. She was a Trinidadian teacher in Harlem, a communist who was deported from the United States and died in England. And this, thank God for Friday, somebody gave me this. My students at the University of Massachusetts labor program gave me this. Thank God for Friday, thank unions for the weekend. And they also gave me this thing, which said, it's "Workers of the World Unite in Glitter."
Oh my gosh.
So it's a glam, "Workers of the World Unite." I really can't answer that. I have no idea. You are going to decide that, because I use some social media. I have a website, and I do that myself, as you know. and I'm glad because it gives me the freedom to put on my website. It's my own website. I can put on my website anything I want to put on it. There's no administrator telling me, oh, that is suitable for posting and that's not suitable for posting. I'm not a big user of social media, I have to admit. I'm curious about it, but I'm not a big user of social media. I'm going to come at this from a somewhat different point of view. Digital work, the fact that so much has been digitized has absolutely changed historical research. If you are doing research on the 19th century and or the early 20th century, and in many instances, much of the 20th century too, you can find so much material online that you would never, ever in a million years be able to get to. We had a student here a few years ago who was doing some research on South African women's activism and their everyday resistance during the apartheid period, Black South African women. And she was able to find oral histories of South African women online. Now, 30 years ago, she would have had to go to the library where they were, and that library might have been in Johannesburg, yeah, or it might have been in Durban, or it might have just been that she was lucky and it was only Chicago, but she sure as heck wouldn't have been able to find all of that material. So there's just a tremendous amount of material that's available online. A few years ago, because as I mentioned, I'm a labor historian, I was doing some research on parallels between the U.S. military's treatment of Native people in the massacre at Wounded Knee and strikers during the Pullman strike 4 years later. And because it was the same soldiers, it was the same units of cavalry that were called out to suppress the ghost dance movement among Lakota people, and then to suppress the strike among Pullman workers in Chicago. And then when they talked about it, they used the similar language. They kind of saw both groups of people as a threat to civilization, and used remarkably similar tropes when they were discussing these people. And I had planned to use an archive at West Point, and they were doing some renovation in the library at West Point, and suddenly I couldn't use it. I thought, oh man, I'm not going to be able to meet the deadline for this article. And but as it turned out, every single thing I needed for that article was available online, because it had been digitized. So more and more and more material that historians can use has been digitized, and maybe it'll reawaken interest in the 19th and early 20th centuries. I've been around long enough so that I have seen the interests of my students move steadily up in history. Now historians, there is in fact even an Institute for Contemporary History. Historians can study the contemporary world because it's really a mindset that we bring to it. We are interested in change over time. Somewhat continuity over time, but our emphasis is usually on change over time. And that's useful in any event. But over the past 25 years, I've seen a diminution of interest in the 19th century and the early 20th century from my students, and they're much more interested in the era of World War II onward. I'm hoping that the digital archives will reawaken interest in the 19th century, which of course is pretty damned important. If you really want to know what created this immensely unequal world we live in, look at the Gilded Age. Look at the closing decades of the 19th century, and you really see some patterns that will be remarkably familiar to you. So I'm hopeful. Now, I don't know if I don't think that's what you mean by social media. I think you mean Instagram and tweets and.
Do you think we'll be citing tweets and Facebook posts in the
Well,
future?
that actually poses a very difficult question for historians because they're so ephemeral. And this is, and if you want to know what your government is doing, which of course is a very important question for all of us, not just the historians, but for any historians of any social movement, the government's a pretty important factor. And so much of what used to be written is now emailed, and the emails are ephemeral. We don't really know as historians how much of that stuff is going to be archived. We can go into the papers of Lyndon Johnson, which are online. By the way, the Johnson Library is digitized a lot. We can go into the papers on Lyndon Johnson, and we can reconstruct the decision to send federal troops into Detroit in the summer of 1967 to suppress an uprising in the black community in Detroit. Mm. Today, the equivalent would be in emails. Are they going to be preserved? I don't know. On the one hand, the government collects much more information on us than it ever did before. On the other hand, it gives us much less information about itself than it ever did before. So that's a question about the digital. But I think that one difference, though, that it's likely to make is that historians of your generation will probably be, even more than historians of mine, in touch with each other across national boundaries, because you'll be able to keep up with each other in a way that historians of my vintage learned to do at conferences. Mm. And you all may learn to do it at virtual conferences and through tweets and whatnot. So what do you think about tweets? Oh, this is a really good one. When I first started teaching, I used to begin every class because I wanted people to start thinking abstractly about history, and I couldn't just say, think abstractly about history, so I would begin. A friend of mine who teaches at the City University, Susan Bessie, turned me onto this device, and I would say, please draw history. And people would draw it. Sometimes they draw a spiral, sometimes they draw a line, and then you could talk about different ways of understanding history. So this one girl, Anna Boysen, many years ago, she was in this class with me, and I said at the beginning, draw history. She drew this kid sitting on a desk, being put to sleep by a teacher who's just saying blah, 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 and then dates. Unintelligible hieroglyphics on the blackboard, and the student is snoozing and then putting up her hand to ask, can I go to the bathroom? And I thought, I'm not anymore, but at that time I was really active in the Radical History Review, so we began a teaching column around that time. And I was one of the editors of the column on teaching, and we used this as our graphic for the first column.
That is so funny.
Anna's drawing of the kid who wants to go to the bathroom. I don't really see them as all that different. Yeah. You know what I do when I want to learn about something? I assign the book.
That's the secret?
So, that's the secret. And Sarah Lawrence, it makes that so easy, because in most colleges you come in to teach and they'll say, like, oh, now you're going to teach American History 101, and this is the textbook we use, this is what you must cover. And that's not what happens at Sarah Lawrence. They ask us, the faculty, to make the curriculum anew every year. And so I think you will find that most of us get interested in a new topic and research it by teaching a course in it. I'll give you an example. I have several times taught a course, it has different names, different times, but it's a course that looks at the history of what is now the U.S. Southwest. Mm-hmm. And it begins with the Spanish conquest of what is now Mexico. Yeah. And goes up into the end of the 20th century. I went to graduate school in the East. I did not take a single course on the Southwest. I knew almost nothing about it, and it did not even occur to me until one day I was looking at a map. This many years ago, I was looking at a map of the United States, and as an Easterner and as a historian who had studied mostly the East. I thought of the conquest of Mexico as a question the way that it had been debated in Congress, which was not about the conquest. The conquest of northern Mexico and the annexation of the forcible annexation of northern Mexico, that had overwhelming support in Congress. Then the question was, would slavery extend into this new territory? And that was really a crucial factor, in certain ways the decisive factor, that made the Civil War happen when it did. Mm-hmm. Yeah. So, because it so split American politics. And then I was looking at the map and I thought, well, I've always been looking at this event from the standpoint of somebody standing with her back to the Atlantic Ocean, looking westward. What if I think of this as an event from the standpoint of somebody with her back to the Pacific Ocean, looking eastward? And then it looked like an entirely different event. And I thought, I'm not equipped to do this. I don't know enough to understand all of the complexities. And so I need to learn about the history of the Southwest. And I got a grant from the college. They gave me a course release to read up on the history, to design a course on the Southwest, which, as I said, I've taught several times. And I now know a lot about the history of the Southwest and the history of Mexico that I otherwise wouldn't have known at all. And I would have gone through life ignorant. And you learn a lot by teaching, in certain ways that are hard to, or maybe they're counterintuitive. That might surprise you. Teaching at Sarah Lawrence is a lot like teaching in a labor education program, because at Sarah Lawrence, because there is no core curriculum, you never have captive students, really. In the undergraduate college, you just don't have captive students. And even for your graduate students, you can say no to certain research seminars. I really don't like that one, right? So because you never have captive audience students, you have to approach the class with a more creative spirit. You have to attract students. Yeah? And the same is true in labor education, where in most environments where you're teaching working people, they're very closely bonded to each other and care deeply about their fellow classmates' opinions of them, much more than they care about the teacher's opinion of them, right? So you have to win them over. And it's, so I think it's made me a better teacher, but it's also because of the freedom that I have to design my classes. Students are sometimes, they think like, oh, you know so much, right? You have a very broad knowledge. It's because I teach here. And I've been able to use my teaching to keep learning. So I'm much smarter. Someone once said to me, you're never again as smart as you are when you take your comprehensive exams as a doctoral student. I am vastly smarter than when I took my comprehensive exams, because I've just never stopped learning. And in most schools you really couldn't do that, but here you can do that. And I'm grateful for that. So I don't really see that as different. And then my first book was an academic book, but my second book, which involved quite a bit of research, some of it secondary, most of it secondary research, but a lot of it primary research, was meant for a popular audience. And that book has given me much more pleasure to write, and I've enjoyed that more than the academic book. So I guess that I see teaching and research as one and the same, but my research is not as arcane as some academic researchers prefer, and my teaching is, I don't think of the teaching as a chore. I really, it's a chance to learn. And I learn so much from my students. At least a third of the stuff that you all think is amazing that I know, I learned from you, right? I learned because, do you think of the number of times they say, I had a student who wrote about that one time. And I learned from directing student research. I learned everything they write, I get to read. So that is really exciting. So I reject the premise of the question. Oh, that was done by a student, Zach Singer, who was in, the undergraduates sometimes take our graduate seminars, and he was in a seminar on revolutionary women, and when he graduated, he gave me this. He was an artist, and these were not all things that we discussed, but things to remember. Structures of production, Fourierism, mobility, it's concepts and facts and things, high desert, accessibility, bread and puppet theater. It's just, so I put it up. I get a lot of student art. The book is called From the Folks Who Brought You the Weekend, A Short Illustrated History of Labor in the United States, but it's really not that short. It's just a fake. I especially enjoyed working on the chapter on the 60s because it gave me a new understanding of the ways in which three things were true actually. Labor movements and movements we associate with the 60s, the Black Liberation Movement, Chicana nationalism, women's liberation, the labor movement, they were intertwined. It also gave me a much deeper appreciation of the ways in which the rank and file activists of these movements for liberation outside the mainstream of the labor movement were working class people. And some of them were students, but they tended to be the children of working class families who were going to college, right? For example, Mecha, the Chicana movement on campus, that's the children of working class people. It's a working class movement. They happen to do it in college, but that's a working class movement. And then the ways that the labor movement itself developed a kind of revolutionary edge. For example, as the liberation movements around the world, not just in the United States. In fact, the United States was not even the heartbeat of the 60s. I mean, that happened much more in the global South than in the United States. But that as these liberation movements for self-determination were growing around the world, one of the things that happened in the United States and elsewhere in the industrial West, by the way, was wildcat strikes. Proliferated. And a wildcat strike is a strike in which the rank and file members of a union over the objection of their union officials go on strike to enforce a demand. And so, and movements for democracy inside unions just proliferated. So they're all connected. And the more I study, the more I see these connections about what's going on in one place and what's going on in another. What's going on under the rubric of labor history, what's going on under the rubric of women's history or African history or the history of Asia or the history of power politics. They're all connected. That started me on teaching this course on the 60s. When I first taught it, it was more focused on the United States. Brought in a few books now. Now it's the United States is not the center of the course at all. The 60s begins with the Vietnamese Declaration of Independence in 1945 and ends with the clerical takeover of the Iranian Revolution in 1979. And there are many things that we read in that course that are about the United States, but most of it's not. And I enjoy teaching that to people and sharing that knowledge, that it's a global movement. At one point, my aunt, my mom's sister, decided that she wanted to know something about the origin of the family, so she did the DNA test, that will tell you what are the origins of your family. And it turns out that our nearest, and what they do is everybody comes from Africa, so they show you where they think your ancestors went after they left Africa. And so for us, that we left Africa and went across what's now known as South Asia, and then up through China, and then across through the steppes and through Central Asia, and then to Northern Europe. And our closest, and then they tell you of all of the tribal people of the world whose genetic heritage is the closest to this. And for us, it was the Nenets of Central Asia. And these are Nenets. I think what I'll do, and I've talked to the publisher about it, so I think that we'll be able to figure all this out. I'll do a second edition, because I know I can get that done in a year. I'll do a second edition of From the Folks Who Brought to the Weekend, because we put that book to bed. I wrote it with my husband, and we put that book to bed right after George Bush was appointed president by the Supreme Court. That's as far as we got. And of course, much has happened since then. It's been another 14 years, really, since 14 and a half now, since Bush took office in early 2001. So I'm anxious to do that. And a lot of folks that I teach in the labor movement are saying to me, do a second edition, do a second edition. So I want to bring that up to date. Then there's one other thing that I want to write. There's another book that I want to write, and I'll begin it. I doubt that I'll finish it before I retire, but I'll keep working on it. And that is, I'm very interested in what happened to the American labor movement after World War II. And I came to this initially because I was interested in military interventions in civilian life. And of course, in the late 19th century, the military intervened constantly in labor disputes. And then after World War II, the military very rarely has intervened in labor disputes. And when it has, it's been strikes by public employees, and they've sent troops in to do the work. You know, sometimes National Guard. In the case of these workers at nursing homes, they might go on strike, and they'll send in the National Guard. Or when the Postal Service went on strike in the early 1970s, they sent in regular troops, regular army went in to deliver the mail. But then I started to think, well, geez, I wonder why they stopped sending troops in with the frequency that they had before World War II. And so I started to read about the McCarthy era and the Cold War at home, and what that had meant for the American labor movement. And I became very interested in that. And it's a very large topic. And I would say that it has still affected us. In fact, it's a whole society. Some people think I'm a radical merely because I will apply class analysis to history. That's not an especially radical thought. But in the United States, because of McCarthyism, that to this day is often seen as a radical practice. If you do a class analysis, that's a very radical practice. You must be a revolutionary if you do that. Well, not necessarily. I mean, it's just makes sense. I mean, you don't have to be a rocket scientist to figure out that we live in a class society. Our national discourse about politics and our labor movement has been very badly damaged. And so I'd like to look at how that happened. And I don't know what I'll call that book, but that's what I'm interested in. You know, someone gave that to me, and I have no idea. And of course, capitalist now, which is used, I noticed the other day in the Democratic debate, the Democratic primary debate, that the moderator asked each one of them, are you a capitalist? Are you a capitalist? Now, a capitalist is somebody who lives off of investments. So, arguably, you could say that Hillary is a capitalist now, because she probably derives most of her income from investments, but none of them really is a capitalist. Donald Trump is a capitalist, right? Now it kind of means, are you a rapacious bastard, right? Are you a rapacious bastard? And so, of course, they're you know, or are you a capitalist, or are you a communist?
Oh yeah.
And but originally, people used it just to mean somebody who lived off of investments. And so I don't know whether this is a joke, you know, that's photoshopped, that it's a joke, or whether that simply is the gravestone of someone who lived off of investments. Oh, golly. No. I mean, I really, I know that I will vote for Bernie Sanders when the time comes, but I live in New York State. So during the primary, I'll probably vote for Bernie Sanders. I will do that because I'm trying to push the Democratic Party to grow a spine and understand that it cannot forever count on the votes of ordinary working people unless it starts truly looking out for them, not just talk, truly looking out for them. And of course, as you may imagine, I am highly unlikely in this lifetime to cast a vote for a Republican candidate. So I think I'll end up voting. My guess is that Hillary Clinton will win the primary. I'll vote for Hillary Clinton. Had Elizabeth Warren run, I'd have worked for her. In fact, I told my husband, if Elizabeth Warren is nominated, I'm quitting my job to work for her. Just want you to know. But I don't think that's going to happen. So if then that is what it is. But that's probably not surprising to anybody who's heard the rest of this interview.